For context, I'm a female. This happened a few weeks after I had totaled my car in an accident. Some guy texting on his phone ran a red light and hit me, but that's a story for another day. I was just finishing up at work. I'm a bartender at this club in my town, so I'm usually there until 2 or 3 in the morning. The car accident left me with a broken arm and several cuts and bruises, but I still had to work, or else I wouldn't be able to pay the rent. On this night, I was finishing up at work sometime around 2:30 a.m. It was a Friday, so the club was packed, meaning lots of cleanup. I ordered an Uber to take me home, since I obviously didn't have a car. It showed up not even 10 minutes after ordering it, so I locked up the building and walked out to the parking lot. My driver's name was Joe, and he drove a black, older-looking Honda Civic. I got in the back seat and said hello, and we got on the road right away. Joe was an older-looking man, maybe in his mid to late 60s, and wore a checkered red and white flannel. He seemed pretty friendly and made some small talk, and he didn't give off weirdo vibes like some of the drivers I had in the past couple weeks. My house was about 15 to 20 minutes away, so we finished up the small talk pretty early in the ride. I was sore, achy, tired, and ready to be home in my comfortable bed. It had been raining for most of the night, which made me even more tired, and I was honestly having a hard time keeping my eyes open. The city had been redoing a lot of the roads, so we had to make a slight detour onto a few cut-through streets. The directions on Joe's phone put us through a pretty sketchy neighborhood. This was an area of the city that is known for frequent gang violence, drugs, and a lot of other crimes. The rain was coming down in sheets, and even with the windshield wipers on full speed, it was really hard to see. We turned down a cut-through street that was very narrow. Rows of cars were parked on each side of the street, and it only looked like one car could pass through at a time. Suddenly, Joe abruptly slammed on the brakes, so I looked up to see what was going on. He pointed at 3 cones in the middle of the road, with a few more surrounding a sewer grate along the curb. Joe said that he was going to get out to move the cones, so I watched from the back seat as he approached them. All of a sudden, the entire inside of the car lit up as a large SUV pulled up behind us with their high beams on. Before I could even comprehend what was going on, another car in one of the driveways in front of us pulled out into the middle of the street, completely blocking us in. Joe immediately sprinted to the car, as at least 6 masked people got out of the 2 cars. Joe got in and threw the car in reverse, ramming into the SUV behind us. There were tons of them right outside the car, kicking, punching, and screaming at us. I was traumatized, and kept screaming to Joe to just give them our money. Well, Joe had another plan in mind. Completely calm, Joe shifted the car into drive, and ran the car blocking the middle of the road. This caused the front end of their car to shift over a few feet, allowing Joe to drive up on the driveway it pulled out from, then tear through the grass to the neighboring driveway. Multiple gunshots followed, as Joe sped away going at least 60 miles per hour, but he was able to completely get away from them. Before I could even think about calling the police, Joe already had them on the phone, and we went straight to the police station. We reported the crime, and an officer drove me back home an hour later. I was really shaken up from the whole incident, especially after just being in a car accident a few weeks prior. But don't get me wrong, I was thankful that Joe saved us from whatever it was they were up to. Well, a few days passed, and I still hadn't heard anything from the police, so the chances of finding them were probably gone. A week later, I found something out, but it was not what I was expecting. I had the news on in the living room while I was making lunch, and the segment that popped up literally made me feel like I was going to throw up. A woman was killed just a few blocks away from where we were attacked. All of my attention instantly focused on the TV. She had been driving through a similar side street at 2 in the morning when she was boxed in by 2 cars, kidnapped, killed, and dumped in an alley. The segment brought me to tears, not just because of the poor woman, but also because that should have been me. Had I not been in a car accident, I would have been driving down that street completely alone at the same time on the same night. I never would have done what Joe did, mostly because it didn't even occur to me as a possibility when it happened. I probably would have just complied with whatever it was they wanted, and most likely would have ended up on the news like that woman. I used to think about my car accident as a case of bad luck, but now I look at it as a blessing, and I'm glad it happened. Had Joe not been my Uber driver, I don't think I would have made it out alive. Working the early morning shift as a receptionist at a local gym had become a pretty boring routine for me. I'd been working there for a year, and it was about a 10 to 15 minute walk on my daily commute. Every day from 5 a.m. to 11 a.m., I'd greet members, check them in, and keep the front desk running smoothly. But on this particular day, a sleepless night left me half asleep on the shift, and by the time 11 rolled around, I was exhausted. I was not up for the walk home, so I called an Uber to take me home so I could go straight to bed. Glancing at the driver's profile on the app, I saw his name was Shane, and his car was a blue sedan. As I settled into the back seat of the car, I instantly noticed that it was freezing. The temperature was only in the 50s, but he had the AC on full blast, which I thought was odd, but I quickly dismissed it. As we started driving, I noticed that Shane was looking at me through the rearview mirror. He noticed my gym uniform and quickly struck up a conversation about my work. Initially, it was harmless chatter about my boss, coworkers, and even the gym's clientele. I engaged, thinking it was just a typical friendly exchange. However, as it went on, the atmosphere shifted. Shane's questions became more probing, delving into personal territory that made me feel uneasy. He began offering unsolicited advice, suggesting that I should use my looks as a tool for career advancement. Overall, I was starting to get really weird vibes from him. Attempting to steer the conversation away from his unsettling remarks, I politely deflected his comments, hoping to regain a sense of normalcy. But to my dismay, he persisted, insisting that this was the only way for a woman like me to get ahead in the workplace. It felt like he was really interested in my personal life, and only seemed to become more frustrated when I didn't give him much of a reply. The minutes ticked by, moving much slower than usual, and I just wanted to go home and sleep, and not have to deal with his invasive questions. Shane continued to talk to me, as he mocked the concept of monogamy, basically dismissing the value of meaningful connections and committed relationships. I personally didn't really care what he had to say, so I just nodded my head, hoping he'd stop talking. After what felt like a 2-hour car ride, we finally arrived at my address. I thanked Shane, eager to exit the car and put an end to the unsettling ride. Right as I opened the door, he asked for my number, but I politely declined. What he said in response really made me feel uncomfortable. "It's fine. I'll get it one way or another." As I stepped out onto the pavement, a knot tightened in my stomach. Rather than heading towards my front door, I made a split-second decision to walk past my house, mostly because I didn't want him to know where I lived, although looking back now, it definitely didn't fool him. As soon as I made it a couple houses down, I noticed that Shane's car still hadn't moved from where I got out. The bad feeling I had was only getting worse, so I kept walking, hoping he'd eventually drive away. Shortly after, he slowly drove past me, but I could tell that he was looking at me through the window. I kept walking until he was out of sight, then turned around to head back to my house. Once I had reached my neighbor's house a couple houses down, I heard the engine of a car approaching. As subtle as possible, I glanced over my shoulder to see that the same blue sedan was approaching. I quickly snapped my head back around, waiting for him to pass. He eventually did, but instead of continuing, he sat at the stop sign at the end of my street and didn't move. It was definitely odd, but I guessed that he might have been getting the directions for his next ride. I cut straight through the grass to the front door, where I stepped in and locked it behind me. My parents were at work, so I was home alone with my cat. Paranoid, I sat down on the couch by the window and looked out. To my disbelief, Shane's car was yet again heading down my street, but this time, he stopped directly in front of my house. He stayed parked there for an entire 5 minutes before driving away once again. Once he was out of sight from the window, I stepped out onto the front porch, and he was there, parked at the stop sign on the end of the street. Panicked, I ran back inside and sat down by the window again. Over the course of the next 10 minutes, Shane continued to pass my house, slowing down every time he neared it. I had enough at that point, so I called the cops and also reported him on the Uber app. As soon as the cop turned on my street, Shane took off in the opposite direction. I could tell by the cop's demeanor that he didn't really care, with the no crime, no problem mentality. I was annoyed, but glad that he was at least gone. A few days later, I was notified from Uber that Shane was removed from the platform, and that was the last I ever heard of him. I don't know what he was doing, but based on my impression of him on the car ride home and how he was stalking my house afterwards, he wasn't up to anything good. I'm glad I called the cops when I did, because if Shane didn't see them, who knows what he might have done. This happened a few years back when I had just graduated college. I had just moved back home, and was in the process of moving into an apartment since I'd be starting my full-time job. A few of my other friends from high school had just graduated too, so everyone was back home for the time being. To celebrate, we decided to go out to some bars in the city. My friends picked me up on a Saturday night, and we went out to enjoy ourselves. The nightlife in the city can get pretty hectic, so we probably ended up going to 5 or 6 different bars because they were all packed. Once we found a nice spot, we spent the rest of the night there until it was already around 1 in the morning. My friend who drove me lived pretty far away from me, so I ordered an Uber so she wouldn't have to drive me back. Keep in mind, it's important to understand that I wasn't necessarily in the clearest state of mind. I probably had a few too many drinks, so once I ordered the Uber, I didn't even pay attention to the kind of car that was picking me up. Maybe 20 minutes later, I stepped out of the bar with my friends while they were leaving and noticed a white Nissan SUV sitting in the parking lot. The driver started flashing their lights at me, and the Uber sign was visible from the dashboard, so I said bye to my friends, then started walking over to the car. I got in the back seat directly behind the driver, who introduced himself as Nero. He had a thick accent and spoke in broken English. We started driving, and within the first few minutes, I was already starting to get creeped out. He was clearly hitting on me, but not in a fun or enticing way. He kept making rude comments that I'd rather not speak about, but needless to say, I was upset, considering his sole purpose was to just drive me from point A to point B. As we were driving through the city, I noticed that he missed the entrance ramp to get on the highway. My house was just off the highway a couple exits away, so I just assumed he was taking the long route. It didn't take me long to realize that we were headed in the opposite direction of my house, so I spoke up. "Hey, I think we're going the wrong way." Instead of saying anything back, I watched his eyes lock onto me through the rearview mirror, and he held a solid stare at me. I shared my location with my friends I was just with, and told them that something was definitely going on. Minutes later, he emerged onto the entrance ramp of the highway, going the complete opposite way, and my anxiety went through the roof. Every part of me wanted to scream, but I tried my best to keep my composure. If it already wasn't confirmed that some random person just picked me up, it was when I got a text from the actual Uber driver that was supposed to take me home, who was waiting in the parking lot at the bar. I tried the door handle to see if I could jump out, but he had the child locks on. I was trapped, so I chose the only option I had. I called 911, but didn't say a word, obviously trying to not give it away that I was on the phone with them. I hoped that they'd track my call, but after a couple minutes, the operator hung up. I called back again, hoping they'd realize it wasn't a butt dial, and this time, they thankfully stayed on the line. I lived down south, and we were headed even further south on the highway, which was maybe about an hour away from the US-Mexico border. I begged the driver to let me out, but he wouldn't acknowledge any of my pleas. I'm not sure how much time passed, but maybe 15 minutes later, he got off at an exit. The cops still hadn't shown up, and I was desperate, so as quietly as I could, I unbuckled my seatbelt, then slowly reached over his left shoulder to hit the child lock button to unlock the doors. By some miracle, this actually worked, and I was able to slip out of the car before he could grab onto me. There were several other cars in front of us, so I ran as fast as I could to the front of the line at the light and banged on the window of a truck. The guy had the window cracked open, so he was definitely able to hear me screaming for help. Thankfully, he let me hop in the truck, and we went through the red light as soon as we got the chance. The car followed behind us for a few minutes, but eventually turned around. Words can't even describe how terrified I was in that whole situation, but I made it out safe. The police asked me tons of questions and tried to gather as much information on Nero as possible. It's most likely that he was using that name as an alias, and I never heard any updates from the police. I'm beyond blessed to have made it out of that alive, and that whole experience has really changed me as a person. I've tried to move on and forget about that night, but it still lingers with me. It's made me extremely paranoid in any public setting, and I'm not sure if I'll ever be the same. I relive that experience every day in my head, and every possible outcome that could have ensued on that night is completely horrifying.